When the gates of Windsor Castle closed behind Prince William and Princess, and on that cold morning, nobody in the royal press corps anticipated the heavy, life-altering truth that was about to be laid bare. The royal family is an institution built on centuries of calculated statements, meticulously drafted protocols, and an ironclad public image capable of weathering political upheaval, personal scandals, and constitutional shifts. Yet, nothing in those centuries of precedent had prepared William for the moment he had to stand before senior household members and speak the words regarding his youngest child, Prince Louis. What began as a series of unexplained moments in private, small stumbles, sudden fatigue, and subtle shifts in physical coordination, had finally culminated in a formal diagnosis of a rare neurological condition. But while the diagnosis itself altered the young prince's daily life, the real storm was brewing in the private corridors of the palace, where William, Catherine, and Princess Anne found themselves locked in an intense disagreement over how to handle the news. William was terrified that releasing details to the public would reduce his son to a medical label, stripping him of a normal childhood before he even had the chance to grow up. Catherine was consumed by a mother's fierce instinct to shield her boy from the cold, clinical machinery of the monarchy. Princess Anne, however, possessed the brutal clarity born of decades of royal service. She understood that in the hyper-connected modern world, silence was not protection. It was an invitation for rampant speculation, dangerous rumors, and invasive media intrusion that would eventually breach the palace boundaries anyway. The room where William finally read the official statement felt less like a hall of state and more like a chamber of grief. Standing beside Princess Anne, whose steady presence acted as both an anchor and a shield, William placed his hands firmly on the wooden table, trying to maintain the stoic composure expected of a future king. He spoke of adjustments to Louis's daily routine, necessary changes to his schooling, and a significant reduction in his public appearances. But when his voice reached the simple phrase referring to his youngest son, the composure fractured, revealing the raw pain of a helpless father. Princess Anne kept her eyes lowered, refusing to let the gathered aides see her nephew's moment of vulnerability as weakness. For weeks prior, Anne had been fighting behind closed doors to prepare William for this exact moment. She had argued that attempting to hide the condition would only leave Louis vulnerable to an unsympathetic press. The journey to this public confirmation had been paved with months of growing anxiety. Catherine had been the first to notice that something was amiss. It started with minor incidents that were easy to dismiss. Louis dropping his toys, moments of sudden exhaustion after brief play sessions, and occasional unsteadiness while running through the gardens. Early medical consultations suggested simple childhood fatigue or temporary developmental phases, and William held tightly to those mild explanations, desperate to believe that rest and time would restore his son's natural energy. However, the illusion of normalcy completely shattered during a private internal rehearsal held inside Windsor Castle. These closed rehearsals are routine for the royal family, designed to prepare young royals for the precise timing, positioning, and physical demands of major public ceremonies. During the exercise, Louis walked across the polished reception room toward his father. Suddenly, without warning, tripping, or distraction, he lost his balance completely and fell to the floor. The room fell into an immediate, terrified silence. When Louis tried to push himself back up, his legs simply failed to respond to his command. William dropped to his knees in an instant, taking his son's hands and gently asking him to squeeze tightly. While one hand gripped with normal strength, the other remained almost entirely limp. The look of quiet worry on William's face transformed into immediate dread. Recognizing the panic in her son's eyes and the shock radiating through the room, Catherine immediately ordered all non-essential staff and aides to leave the hall. Princess Anne moved swiftly to close the heavy double doors, personally ensuring that any mention of the incident was scrubbed from the internal palace schedule to prevent leaks. The examining physician called to the scene confirmed that the fall was part of a broader neurological pattern, warning William that delay in seeking specialized treatment could cost vital time. It was then that Anne uncovered a troubling detail. 2 previous physical stumbles had been dismissed by junior aides as ordinary childish clumsiness. Infuriated by the oversight, and demanded a complete accounting of every internal report, while William followed the specialist into a private corridor to ask the one question every parent dreads: whether his son would ever fully recover. The long, heavy silence from the doctor before giving a cautious response hit William harder than any official diagnosis ever could. The silence following the specialist's cautious answer lingering in the corridor marked the moment the crisis transformed from a medical emergency into a full-scale battle over the future of the monarchy's youngest member. Behind locked doors in a private study at Windsor Castle, away from advisors, press secretaries, and household staff, William, Catherine, and Princess sat across a heavy mahogany table, facing a choice that no traditional royal protocol could resolve. The diagnostic report sat between them. 2 pages of clear medical facts confirming that while the disorder was serious, early and consistent treatment offered a path toward stability, provided Louis was given adequate rest, low stress, and protection from physical overexertion. To Catherine, those recommendations were a sacred boundary that must not be compromised for any public appearance or tradition. She read through the draft statement prepared by palace communications officers and pushed it back across the table, her voice trembling with a mixture of grief and anger as she declared that the words sounded cold, distant, and constitutional, capturing nothing of the terror her young son had experienced on the reception room floor. She looked directly at William and reminded him that Louis was their son first, not a piece of public relations machinery to be managed. William, caught between his instinct as a protective father and his duty as the heir to the throne, argued that total silence was no longer an option. He knew that in the modern era, unexplained absences from major family gatherings would immediately trigger wild media speculation, invasive paparazzi activity, and unverified leaks that would ultimately harm Louis far more than a controlled announcement. As the argument between William and Catherine intensified, with Catherine accusing him of prioritizing institutional obligations over their child's emotional safety, Princess stepped in with crucial information that instantly shifted the entire dynamic. Revealing details from a private household security briefing she had personally conducted, and informed them that an unauthorized request for Louis's updated autumn schedule had already been made by someone within the broader palace staff. The secret was already moving beyond their inner circle, and hesitation would mean losing control of the narrative entirely, and proposed an uncompromising solution, a joint official statement delivered by William, with standing beside him as both a witness and a shield to absorb the inevitable media pressure, while Catherine remained completely isolated with Louis, far away from the cameras and public scrutiny. She looked at William and made a firm promise that as long as she held influence within the royal household, no ceremonial timetable or tradition would ever outrank the boy's medical care. With the decision made to move forward, Princess immediately assumed command of restructuring the royal calendar, demonstrating the sharp strategic execution that has defined her decades of service to the crown. She began by auditing every single commitment attached to Prince Louis's name, putting every official appearance, ceremonial rehearsal, and public gathering under immediate review. Understanding that what was once considered routine family participation could now cause severe physical fatigue and public exposure, she systematically removed Louis from all upcoming formal engagements. Almost instantly, and encountered firm resistance from senior household officials who warned that removing the young prince from prominent public events would create noticeable gaps in family appearances and fuel public speculation, and confronted their concerns directly, coldly pointing out that they were worrying about public optics while a child was trying to regain control of his own body. When an official cited an archaic household protocol requiring young royals to participate in ceremonial duties unless completely incapacitated, and shut down the argument instantly, declaring that physical and emotional well-being would henceforth be the only metric that mattered. She placed the medical specialist's written recommendations on the table, took full personal responsibility for overriding the schedule, and closed the engagement book, effectively ending all internal debate. While fought the administrative battles within the palace hierarchy, the psychological impact of the diagnosis was beginning to settle heavily inside the family's residence. The morning following the public announcement, Windsor felt noticeably altered. External security measures were heightened, public messages poured in from around the globe, and household staff began speaking in hushed, overly cautious tones whenever Louis entered a room. Catherine observed this shift with growing alarm, realizing that despite their best efforts to protect him, the environment was treating her son differently. People were no longer reacting to Louis as a spirited young boy, but rather reacting to his medical diagnosis. Simple daily routines became sources of frustration. When an aide instinctively reached out to assist Louis with a task he had always managed independently, the young prince pulled back sharply, asking why everyone suddenly assumed he was incapable. Hearing the quiet anger and underlying fear in her son's voice, Catherine confronted the household staff later that afternoon, establishing strict boundaries that no staff member was to assist, carry, or guide Louis without his explicit permission. She was determined that while his physical abilities might face challenges, his independence, self-respect, and dignity would remain entirely intact. Meanwhile, the security of the family's privacy faced another sudden breach when William received a confidential message warning that unreleased details regarding Louis's fall during the Windsor rehearsal were circulating among external royal commentators. Deeply disturbed by the leak, and initiated an internal review and discovered that a junior staff member had contacted an outside PR consultant shortly after the incident, naively believing the palace needed to prepare for a public crisis. Though the leak was born of panic rather than malice, it highlighted just how fragile their privacy truly was. Later that evening, William watched from a window as Louis attempted to walk down a paved garden path alone, pausing halfway as his balance faltered. Resisting the urge to rush out and carry him, William walked out slowly, stood beside his son, and gently offered his hand, allowing Louis to take it and steady himself on his own terms. That silent gesture of support signaled a fundamental shift in how William viewed his role. Returning indoors, William took down Louis's official schedule from the private notice board and replaced it with a blank page, promising Catherine that from that day forward, their son's life would be dictated solely by his health and happiness, entirely free from the burdens of royal expectation. The shift in how Prince William viewed his duty signaled the beginning of a profound transformation. But the emotional core of the crisis reached its most delicate point during an unscripted, private conversation between Prince Louis and Princess Anne. Away from formal meetings, medical specialists, and official documentation, Princess Anne spent quiet time alone with the young prince, having observed how unusually reserved he had become whenever his father entered the room. Sitting together in a quiet corner of the Windsor residence, Louis finally voiced the hidden fear that had been weighing on his young mind since the diagnosis was confirmed. Look at his aunt with genuine innocence and anxiety. He asked whether his unsteady balance and the changes to his physical strength meant that his father was no longer proud of him, and whether he would still be allowed to accompany William to major events when he grew older. For Princess Anne, that heartbreaking confession laid bare the deepest casualty of the ordeal. Louis had overheard adults speaking in hushed tones about canceled duties and medical schedules, and in his childlike reasoning, he believed he had somehow failed his father and become a burden to the family's future. Princess Anne addressed his fears with the gentle authority and unwavering honesty that have defined her character for decades. Placing her hand reassuringly over his, she explained that his father's sadness came entirely from profound love and a deep desire to protect him, never from disappointment. She reassured him that William was not grieving the child standing before him, but rather hurting because his son had to face a challenge that no father, not even a future king, could simply order away. During that same conversation, Louis revealed a detail that completely reframed the timeline leading up to the diagnosis. He had actually noticed his balance faltering weeks before the fall during the Windsor rehearsal, but he had chosen to hide his stumbles and keep quiet when he dropped objects because he did not want to make his parents worry. Deeply moved by his quiet effort to appear brave, and promised him that he would never again have to hide his pain or carry anxiety alone to protect the adults around him. To seal that promise, she unpinned a small silver service pin from her jacket, a symbol of duty and dedication, and placed it into his small palm, telling him that true courage is not standing perfectly without ever falling, but having the strength to ask for help when it is needed. When William entered the room moments later, Louis spoke before fear could hesitate him, admitting his quiet terror of becoming a burden. William immediately dropped to his knees, embraced his son tightly, and vowed that while the family would change every schedule and tradition necessary to support him, they would never ask him to earn his place in their hearts. That emotional breakthrough transformed the atmosphere within Windsor Castle, giving the family the unified strength needed to face the outside world. By sunrise the following morning, the news of the diagnosis had resonated far beyond palace walls, triggering an unprecedented wave of public sympathy across the globe. Outside the gates of Windsor Castle, thousands of well-wishers gathered, leaving handwritten letters, flowers, and small toys. Global media outlets shifted their coverage away from constitutional politics and succession lines, focusing instead on the universal story of a family rallying around a vulnerable child. Medical charities reported a massive surge in public interest and donations for juvenile neurological research, while parents from all walks of life shared personal stories of navigating similar challenges with their own children. Despite the overwhelming warmth of the public response, Catherine remained steadfast in protecting Louis from being turned into a public spectacle. When palace officials suggested organizing a stage photo opportunity to reassure the nation, Catherine firmly rejected the idea, refusing to put her son on display or demand that he perform strength for strangers while still learning to navigate his condition. Instead, Princess drafted a brief, dignified official message expressing the family's deep gratitude to everyone who had shared their support, intentionally omitting unnecessary medical details and making no demands for public appearances. William personally added a final line to the statement, declaring that his son's worth and place in the family had never depended on ceremonial duties, physical abilities, or public expectations. This powerful statement redefined the relationship between the monarchy and the public, proving that compassion and human vulnerability could coexist with royal responsibility. The final resolution came during a definitive meeting between William, Catherine, Princess Anne, and senior household leadership. The frantic negotiations over leaks, press releases, and public optics were replaced by a clear, unified commitment to Louis's long-term well-being. Specialists confirmed that while therapy would help Louis build stability and independence over time, progress would be slow and unpredictable, requiring a flexible environment free from rigid timelines. William made the historic decision to permanently abolish all automatic ceremonial expectations placed on Louis during his childhood, decreeing that he would attend public events only when he wished to, when his parents agreed, and when his medical team deemed it safe. Furthermore, William established a new, permanent family policy dictating that the health and emotional needs of every royal child must take precedence over official calendars. Picking up the old engagement diary containing Louis's canceled duties, William symbolically tore out the pages and placed a blank book before Catherine, declaring that from that day forward, their son's life would be written around who he is, not what the institution expected him to be. As Catherine placed a reassuring hand on her husband's shoulder, it was clear that William's greatest act of leadership was not the exercise of royal power, but the courageous decision to adapt the monarchy to protect his child.